Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. Today we have a special guest, so it's going to be an interview on Welsh folk witchcraft with our special guest that I will be introducing in a second. Before I start, just a disclaimer that, as you know, my channel is about the the dissemination of academic scholarship. And I have interviews with academics, but I also have interviews with practitioners because I think that both are very valuable and important. And one of the aims of my project is to bridge the gap between the ivory tower of academia and the community of practitioners. So when I interview a practitioner is very similar to when I'm on the field. As you know, I'm an anthropologist of religion. So when I'm on the field and I interview practitioners, I listen to them and I try to understand their point of view. So in no way this is going to be an endorsement. I have to clarify that because of past situations. But now that is out of the way, I can finally introduce to you our special guest, who's Mara Starling. Thank you so much for coming over and accepting my invitation, Mara.
Oh, gosh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, as I was telling Mara, I watched her talk at Witchfest this year. We were both there as speakers, and I attended their talk, and it was amazing. It was both very interesting in terms of the content, and you will talk us about your book as well. But also, I mean, the way that you, I mean, you really have a lot to teach me in terms of, you know, stage presence. What's the term? Yeah, stage presence, because you're really a great speaker.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I try and put my everything into it, do as my teachers taught me, speak clearly and speak from the hoo-ha and all that. And it captivates people, I see. So I'm glad that you thought so.
I should do more of that too as well. So tell us something about yourself and your journey in Welsh witchcraft.
Oh, so my name is Mara, as you've just mentioned and introduced me. I'm originally from an island that is located at the very tippy top of North Wales. And my first language is not English, it's Welsh. So I grew up in a Welsh-speaking community, did all my schooling through the medium of the Welsh language. And that was quite a privilege because that's not something everybody in Wales can say confidently and comfortably. We do have more Welsh language schools nowadays than we used to, and there is like a huge resurgence in the Welsh language to the point where there's a lot of support behind it nowadays, and there's people learning the language across Duolingo and such. But I was privileged enough to have grown up in a completely Welsh speaking community, and I grew up in a place that was also rather magical as well. It's very hard growing up where I grew up to not have an interest in anything that is to do with magic. So I grew up on Ynys Môn, the Isle of Anglesey, and anybody who's ever looked into the kind of pagan history of Britain and such, the pre-Christian history of Britain, will kind of acknowledge and accept that Anglesey is a very important place because it was the last stronghold of the Druids, according to the classical writers like Tacitus, I don't know how to pronounce his name, one of the Roman writers. Yes. So he wrote about the siege of Anglesey when the Romans came and they slaughtered the Druids because the Druids were seen as a threat to the Roman Empire. And it was said that Anglesey, the island of Anglesey, was the main primary area that the Druids did their schooling in. So it was said that people traveled from all across, not just Britain as a whole, but also from continental Europe to Anglesey, to Ynys Môn, to train as a Druid. We don't know how true that is, of course, because that's just based on what the classical writers wrote. But it seems that Anglesey has this image, this identity as a spiritual center for the longest time in pre-Christian Britain. And that is kind of, you can see it in the landscape. I always make a joke. You can't kick a rock on Anglesey without hitting some sort of ancient landmark, ancient monument. I grew up just a 5-minute walk from a cairn, so like a little circle of stone where it's been said that human activity has been found there for the last 10,000 years. But this cairn goes back at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. And then just around the corner from that one, just up the road a bit, there's also this glorious burial chamber called Bar Clotiad y Gawres, which is a huge, huge structure. It's a huge chambered tomb. And so growing up in that area, in that landscape, it was difficult not to have a bit of a love and an appreciation for magic, because as I said, that chamber, that burial chamber, the big one, its name was Bar Clotiad y Gawres, which translates to mean essentially the giantess's apron full. So behind these ancient monuments, there was also this body of folklore, this body of mythology that had built up around it as well. And the story behind Bar Clotiad y Gawres was that a giant was carrying a bunch of rocks in her apron and she dropped them, and that's what created the structure. Now, of course, ask an archaeologist and they'll tell you a completely different story of how that structure came to be. But it's always really fascinating to see how our ancestors looked at these monuments and the stories they created to make sense of them in the world, because to them it was just a pile of very massive rocks and they didn't know how they got there. So their only example or explanation was it must have been a giant. So those kind of stories captivated me. And I had a fondness from a very young age in things like fairies and mermaids and witches and giants and wizards. And my teachers, they really, really loved that I had an interest in those kind of things. I went to a school so growing up in a rural kind of village area, I went to a school that only had 26 students in total. And so my teachers had that opportunity to sit one-to-one with us and to really push our interests. So they would direct me when I told them I love fairies and I love folklore and I love mythology. They would push me in the direction of Welsh folklore and Welsh mythology. So I learned through them the stories of the four branches of the Mabinogi, which are old oral storytelling kind of things that come from the oral tradition, the bardic tradition of Wales, that are preserved in medieval manuscripts. And they would teach me these stories, and a lot of them are rooted in locale, so like in places that were familiar to me. So things like, oh, there was this giant who was a king and he ruled from Harlech, and it was like, oh, I've been there. My parents took me there last week. Or there was a princess who married an Irish king, and she got married in a village called Aberfraw on the Isle of Anglesey. And I was like, that's where I'm from. That's the village I'm from. So there was this sense of closeness with these stories. There was this feeling that the stories were not, these fantastical tales that happened once upon a time in a land far, far away. They were here and they were alive and they were part of our culture and are very much today, not just part of some ancient past. And they were presented to us as if they were history almost, rather than folk tales. They were taught to us as if they were part of our cultural history. So I grew really, really fond of those things. But then on the other side, I also had my grandmother who was really into oogie boogie woo woo stuff, shall we say. And she liked tea leaf readings and tarot readings, and she loved to potter around doing things like that for people. So she brought me to this interest in the metaphysical side of things. So I had this interest in folklore and this interest in magic, so to speak, or divination and such. And when she died, that interest only grew stronger because she was like my best friend in the whole world. She was the only one I ever trusted or that ever understood me. And she kind of brought me this sense of belonging in the world that I didn't see otherwise. And when she passed away, I just wanted to feel close to her. I wanted to feel as close to her as possible. And I started finding books in charity shops. I remember this one particular book was called Spells for Teenage Witches. And I was almost a teenager at that point. I was in my pre-teens. And when I found that book, it was like, oh, this reminds me of Nine, of my grandmother, and I want to grow closer to this. And through that, I ended up meeting a bunch of witches that lived on the island, so actual modern day witches. My mother told me about a woman who lived in the village who happened to be a witch. She was like, I think she's a witch. You should go ask her. And I did. I was bold and brassy, and I went and knocked on her door and said, my mum tells me that you're a witch. Is that true? And she looked me up and down and went, depends why you're asking. And then I ended up saying to her, well, I want to learn everything I can about witchcraft. Can you teach me? And she did. She took me under her wing. She became a mentor to me. Through her, I met Christopher Hughes, who is the chief of the Anglesey Druid Order, who runs this kind of modern order of druids on the island today. And from there, everything just kind of snowballed, and it became my entire life, and my entire being was marrying this love I had for folklore and mythology with an actual spiritual, religious, and magical practice that incorporated those beliefs and those ideas into it. So I always say that my practice is rooted in the landscape from which I'm from. It's inspired and informed by the stories of the past, by the historical accounts we have of witchcraft and magic from Wales, but it is very much anchored in today. So I never pretend to be something I'm not. I'm a modern day witch. I'm a modern day person. I live in the modern world, but I'm inspired and informed by folklore, by history, by my culture, and by my language. So all of that informs who I am today as a Welsh witch.
Yeah, I love that. I think that often on my channel I talk about, and especially in my Patreon community when we have our lectures, I talk about the fact that there is often practitioners tend to not quite look at history as it is, but there are also practitioners that actually acknowledge what the history is. And because I think that there is this kind of assumption that if something is ancient and historical, that makes it more worthy or more authoritative. Whereas even when something is present and alive and effective and meaningful, that is effective in and of itself, I would argue.
Yeah, definitely. It's something I spoke about in my book. I have a whole section on the idea that antiquity equals authenticity. So for me personally, I'm a bit of an obsessive when it comes to reading about the history of specifically my culture and its very strange history when it comes to witchcraft and such. But at the same time, sometimes I think there is this lack in modern paganism, especially when people do start looking towards kind of more academic fields and such. There is this lack of acknowledging and accepting that there needs to also be a bit of gnosis as well, a bit of inspiration that forms and forges the path ahead. We can't just look at trying to recreate what our ancestors did, because we're not living in their world anymore. So I always argue that, that there's a lot of things in modern paganism that is not ancient, and we shouldn't pretend that it is, but that doesn't make it any less authentic. That doesn't make it any less real. One example that I can give from my culture in particular is Druidry. So the Druids, we don't know what the bloody hell they did. We don't know what the Druids actually did, because they didn't write anything down, the annoying little sods. So they didn't keep a record of what they did in a way that we can now look back to and go, this is what the Druids did. We're going to do exactly what they did and try and recreate it. We can't do that, because the only accounts we have are whispers and little hints that can be found in historical documents from other cultures that were alive at the same time as the Druids. So I get a lot of people who often reach out to me and they say, how can there be this whole huge culture of neo-pagan Druidry in Wales and in Britain as a whole if we don't know what the Druids did? And it's always an awkward one to answer, because I know people are looking for that authenticity that comes from antiquity, and it can't always come from that for us. So I'm always really excited to talk to people about the Druid revivalism of Wales. It's a huge part of our culture as a whole. In Wales here today, we have a huge national festival called the National Eisteddfod. And Eisteddfod is a celebration of poetry and art and music and everything to do with our culture and our language. And the folks who run the Eisteddfod are Druids. They are cultural Druids. We refer to them as the Druids, as the Gorsedd, and the Gorsedd Druids specifically. There's an archdruid that runs the event. There's a whole body of Druids that run it too. But most of those Druids are Christian. Their Druidry is nothing to do with their kind of religious background. It's a cultural kind of thing that they've put in place. And this has been going on since at least the 18th century now, and was a huge part of the revival of this sense of identity for Welsh culture that moved away from the homogenization of kind of British culture as a huge overarching thing. It was a way for us to step out and go, actually, we should be proud of our own language and our own heritage. And the people who started the Eisteddfod, or specifically the person who started the Eisteddfod traditions as we know them today, they were also responsible for influencing the rise of modern pagan Druidry. So a lot of it comes from those same sources. And their influence and inspiration came from looking at these ancient manuscripts, ancient poetry, and such that we have here in Wales. But they created something that was also new and alive and obviously spoke to people in a way that it kind of sparked something new in our entire culture. And I think there's a magic to that. There's a magic to the fact that this small idea that came to them from this inspiration of looking towards this idea, this romanticized idea of the ancient Druids, it created and crafted this sense of national and cultural identity that is still being pushed to this day.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. How, something like that can actually, well, I wouldn't say recreate, but create something that that is inspiring and is helpful for the folklore, the culture and the folklore of a specific place. So, how would you define Welsh witchcraft?
So I think if it comes to defining Welsh witchcraft, I have to do a little disclaimer first and just make it clear that my version of Welsh witchcraft is mine alone. And it's something that I have kind of cemented into my practice and my everyday life for me. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are probably Welsh or who have Welsh ancestry or some kind of connection to Wales who might disagree with my version of Welsh witchcraft, but it is what works for me and what I've kind of come to terms with after having been raised in this culture, speaking Welsh as my first language, and the way that I've kind of created a practice that works for me that is a mixture of various different things. So my Welsh witchcraft is a witchcraft that, as I mentioned earlier, is inspired and informed by the past. So I like to look at the historical records we have of witchcraft here in Wales, of folk magic specifically as well. I like to look at the folk magical traditions that we had in Wales. And I like to draw as much inspiration from that as possible, as well as mythology, or specifically the bits and drips and drabs that we find from things like the Mabinogi and medieval literature, as to the beliefs in magic and sorcery and all these things that we find from older Welsh culture. And I draw these things together and I root them in the here and now by acknowledging that I'm also a modern person, and some things that are very modern work. They work, and that's what's important to me. And my personal witchcraft is I don't base what I do in a day-to-day sense as a modern day witch based on, is it historical, is it true, is it something that goes back to 3,000 years ago. I don't care about that. What I care about is, does it work? Does it actually do what it needs to do? Do the spells that I'm practicing actually do the job? Do the rituals that I'm conducting actually do what they need to do? So that's kind of where my witchcraft lies. It's this relationship, this symbiotic relationship between a love and appreciation for lore and history and the culture of my landscape, whilst also looking at how exactly we can make it work, so to speak. So my witchcraft is inspired predominantly by the folklore and by the history of the magic that is found in my specific area. So I like to look specifically at the culture that's found in North Wales and Anglesey. But I do also like to just look a bit more broadly. So my witchcraft is rooted in an appreciation for the land and a love for the land, in a relationship and a connection with the spirits of the land, with the gods of that landscape. And I know it's a bit controversial to call them gods, but it's what I call them. And I also have a love and fondness for traditional folk magical techniques that were used throughout history. And when I do find that those little bits of information on charms and spells and curses and things that were used in history, I love to try and incorporate those into my practice if they are useful and if they are beneficial, and also alter them if needs be as well, because some of them just do not work for today's day and age. So my witchcraft is kind of a mixture of this inspiration and information that comes from the past, but a rooting and an anchoring that's here and now in the present day. And a lot of it comes from my love of the language and the culture and the land itself. So it's those three things create the Triskel that is my practice. It's a love for land, a love for culture, and a love for language, and it culminates into the witchcraft that I practice today.
Mm. And what do you think makes Welsh witchcraft different and unique compared to other forms of witchcraft?
Oh gosh. So there's a few ways that I think we look at things a little differently when it comes from a Welsh cultural context. One thing that I think I struggle with a lot in modern witchcraft circles lately, I remember recently I had a discussion with somebody about the power present in words, the power present in the spoken word. And this person in particular I was talking to was an English person. They were from England, and we were at an event. We were at a conference that was being held in England, and we were talking about whether or not you need certain things in witchcraft, and specifically, we were talking about the need for things like accoutrements, so like tools and robes and words and such. And she was saying, you don't need any of that. You can just sit and you can meditate on what you want, and that's enough of a spell. You can make that happen alone like that. And I sort of disagreed. While I understand the idea and the thought that goes behind that, there's a kind of there's a bit of a cultural thing that stops me from being able to fully appreciate that. And that is that within our culture, words, especially the spoken word, are animate living things. So it's not that they're just sounds that we make that come out of our mouths. They are literally alive and ever present and powerful in their own right. So this is an idea that goes back to the bardic tradition of Wales. So the bards are a class of people that existed throughout Wales, and they still do exist to an extent, but they're not as revered as they once were. So long ago, the bards were bards to kings. They were usually put under the patronage of a king or a ruler or somebody very important. And these very important people would pay the bards to be in their presence and to write poetry about them and such. And the thing about the bards is that they were very much powerful. They had the power to sway culture and the nation as a whole. So they had the power to either make or break a king. So they were present usually in the crowning, in the coronation of rulers or kings, as we'd call them today. They were present at very important cultural events and festivals, and they had the power to in basically just inspire the people. They had the power to drive the people to either think that this king was good or bad, and whether which direction they went kind of was very important to the culture of that area at the time. And their power came from words alone. Just the right set of words said at the right time, said in the right way, could change the entire dynamic of the culture. So words were considered this animate living thing that the bards had power over, and those who were able to weave words in an effective way were inherently powerful. So this concept of words being powerful is also rooted in this other concept called awen. So we have this idea within Welsh culture, awen, and it's something that we can kind of trace the word awen in written record all the way back to around the 6th century, but it's probably something that existed even before that. That's just the oldest document we have that mentions it. But awen is this really interesting concept because it is very much rooted in modern paganism today, but it's not something that was sprung up just from modern paganism. If somebody is very familiar with modern day druidry, like if you are a member of something like the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, or the Ancient Druid Federation, or any of these kind of modern day druid orders, they're probably very familiar with the symbol of the 3 rays pointing downwards, with usually 3 dots above it and 3 circles around it. But that symbol, if you ask a modern day druid, what does it mean? If they don't say, oh, it's the symbol of druidry, they will usually say it's the symbol of awen. But awen is something that goes really far back into Welsh history. So the symbol, as we know it, doesn't have as much antiquity to it. It's probably from around the 18th century that symbol started being associated with this concept, this idea. But the concept itself, we can trace back really, really far into history. And it's this idea that essentially there is this force that flows throughout the entire world. And this force starts its life in the other world. So in Welsh tradition, we call the other world Anwfn. And Anwfn is, it translates to essentially mean the very deep. So an is an intensifying prefix, and oven is a suffix that denotes depth. So it means something like the very or the intense deep of a soul. And this force starts its life in that place, in this deep otherworldly place. It is formed by some form of divine hands, where from which it flows through the other world, and from the other world, because the other world and our world within Welsh tradition are very, very deeply connected to one another. They're not separated by a barrier like a veil or anything like that. You can flow between our world and the other world very easily. And this force comes from the other world, seeps into our world, and then it takes hold of us. It takes hold of us, and we are moved by it. And this force is very much animate and alive. It's very much, it has almost its own autonomy and its own identity, and it flows almost. So the way it's described in poetry is that it flows like air. And the word awen itself is etymologically rooted in the same origin as the words for things like breath in the Welsh language. So the word breath or breeze comes from the word awel, and then this word awen is this divine inspiring force. And it was believed that once the bards, or once anybody who was divinely inspired, breathed in the awen would move through them to help them craft something that was beyond themselves as well. So usually that came in the form of poetry or in the form of prophecy. So poetry and prophecy were deeply linked as well. So yes, this idea of awen is rooted in the bardic tradition. The bards believed in awen, and a lot of their work was about trying to force the awen to flow through them so that they could create this powerful poetry that can move people. So to me, and to anyone who really roots themselves in Welsh culture, words are not just pretty words that we say. They're not just pretty fun things that we incant or say during ritual. They are living, animate spirits in their own right. And when we allow the awen to take hold of us and we create something like a poem or an incantation or a song, it is divinely imbued, and it is inherently magical, and it can change things around you. So words, poetry, song, all of these things are inherently important when it comes to the magic found in Wales. And we find this carrying over throughout history as well. So a lot of early modern charms follow certain poetic techniques because they follow the similar kind of rhythmic patterns to them and such. A lot of poetry tends to have certain strict rules as to how it can be crafted so that the awen can flow through it better. And the bardic tradition, as it existed in the past, still sort of exists to this day, because the highest accolade that you can receive in Wales, the highest kind of honour or award that we give our people, isn't given to a soldier or a powerful kind of warrior or a noble person or a rich person. The most powerful and greatest award that we give someone in our culture is given to the best poet. So even to this day, we still revere and honor poetry and the spoken word as this powerful and animate part of our culture. It's what moves us. It's what moves our entire culture, is the spoken word and our connection to language, because our connection to language roots us to the land, and our connection to land roots us to ourselves. So yeah, I think that's a huge part of what makes Welsh witchcraft unique to me, is this real connection with the spoken word, with the language, and with the heritage that is found throughout all of that connects us to something that's beyond ourselves.
Oh, that's beautiful. I was thinking, in terms of the witchcraft per se, in terms of the magic, do you think that cultural connection makes the magic more effective? Or because you said that you don't agree with the view that intention would just do it in terms of magical effectiveness. So do you think that the cultural connection and the use of the word and the things you've talked about also have an impact on the effectiveness of magic? Or is it more about the identity of the witch and how they are placed, how they see themselves within their practice, because obviously witchcraft practice is not just about the effectiveness of magic, but has also an entire background and religious and spiritual um, system around it, a belief system around it.
Yeah, so I think that a connection to, so it's specifically talking about Wales now, Welsh landscape. The language itself carries our culture and carries our identity. So our culture is one that has long been suppressed and misunderstood. It's one that is often overlooked. We're often seen as just being, a part of Britain or a part of England specifically. I remember when I went to university and I met people from all over the world, there were a lot of people who didn't even know we existed, let alone that we were our own country, our own nation, our own culture with our own language and our own history and such. So to us, a lot of our identity is rooted in the language itself, which can be a controversial thing to talk about because only just over 20% of the population of Wales speak Welsh fluently. So Welsh as a language is something that often ruffles a few feathers. A lot of people from England see the Welsh language as a threat to the idea of British identity because it breaks down that idea of this homogenized idea of British culture. But also within Wales itself, because of this suppression that we've been through, because of this trying and attempting to stamp out our culture in favor of this overarching British culture, there are some people who get really uncomfortable when you mention that our culture is carried by the language itself, because a lot of people were not afforded the same privilege of being able to speak the language. And for the longest time, I went through a phase in my teen years where I didn't understand why more people in Wales didn't make more of an effort to learn the language and to carry the culture, because I grew up, speaking it constantly, and I felt like, well, it's not that hard. I can do it. Why can't other people just learn? And then when I started looking into the history of why it is that the Welsh language has struggled for so long, and that it's because of this direct kind of concentrated effort from British culture, British homogenized culture, or specifically English culture, to try and stamp it out, it made more sense to me, because a lot of areas where Welsh isn't spoken anymore in Wales are very urbanized areas, areas that had a lot of movement, areas that had a lot of people moving from other parts of Britain and even Europe in order to build a new life. And it's areas that went through a lot during kind of the Industrial Revolution and such. So it's kind of interesting to look at how the language survived better in more rural areas, and that myself, I grew up in a place that was quite rural, so I had the privilege of being able to speak the language on a day-to-day basis, at home, at school, at work, wherever I wanted, whereas other people did not get that privilege. And I only just started acknowledging in the past kind of 15 years that it is a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to speak Welsh and to be able to carry that culture through. But it is still true that the language itself carries the culture and carries the older traditions that we have. So, for example, it's harder to find a lot of evidence of older folklore and such in areas where the language was almost stamped out. So we see this kind of tradition of the language almost gripping the culture of Wales so much and keeping people in touch with that side of themselves that pulled them away from this homogenized idea of Britishness and instead towards Welshness. In where I grew up, a lot of people will get very angry if you call them British. They'll say, I'm not British, I'm Welsh. And that's a huge part of their cultural identity there. So the language itself is not only something that roots us to our culture and our heritage, but also something that roots us to the landscape and also to our magic. And this is something that, so Ronald Hutton recently did a talk for Gresham College on finding the gods of Wales. And he talked about this briefly, and it's something that he touched upon only in like one sentence, but it's something that I'm really deeply interested in, is the idea that the Welsh language was created first and foremost, because we can kind of trace the roots of the Welsh language, and it evolved from a common form of Brythonic, which was the common Celtic language that was spoken on what we now dub the island of Britain. It evolved from that older common Brythonic into modern day Welsh eventually. And when we trace the roots of why Welsh was formed, how Welsh became a language, it's really, really fascinating because it began its life as a language of poetry and, in essence, also a language of magic. It was formed predominantly in order to be a language that poetry could be spoken in. It was a common tongue that poets could use so that all the different Brythonic Celtic speaking tribes could speak the same language during their poetic verse and their prophecy and everything that poetry incorporated. But when we look at the way in which poetry was used back then, it's a very different thing nowadays. We think of poetry and we think of very depressed looking teenagers writing poems about the girl that they love at school and such. But if we go far back enough in Welsh history, poetry was almost used as a form of ceremonial magic because it was used during rituals or specifically ceremonies that were used to make kings, to build up the warriors of the tribe, to help build this sense of identity and worth in the kingdoms that they were from. So poetry acted as this form of almost ceremonial magic, and that poetry was spoken in the ancestor of Welsh, and then eventually that language became what we now speak as the common everyday Welsh language. So the language itself is inherently magical because it inherently comes from this form of ceremony that was utilized by these bards who were essentially magicians who could cause all sorts of things to happen in their domain. So when we look at it like that, we see that there is this strong rooting between language, magic, and culture. And I think when it comes to a Welsh specific context, one of the most powerful things you can do in order to connect to your own magic that is rooted in your ancestry and your locale and your landscape is to learn the language and to immerse yourself in the culture of it. And that doesn't mean that you have to become a fluent conversational speaker. It just means incorporating the words that we use in Welsh every day. It means learning the native names of the local rivers or the local mountains, the local hills and such. It means trying to reject the names that were plastered over the Welsh landscape in favor of acknowledging and embracing the original names that were given to these places by the people who have lived in this landscape for thousands of years. So there is, in my view, this connection between culture and magic. There is this deep, deep connection between culture and magic. And through becoming closer to your own culture, learning more about your culture, learning the language, doing all you can to preserve the culture, it will give you a firmer grounding, I think, specifically in this landscape. I'm not going to talk for other cultures, they can have their own opinions, but in this culture specifically, I would say that a connection and a reverence for the culture will also help you grow a connection and a reverence to the land, and in turn, the gods of that land, the spirits of that land, and your own sense of self, your ancestors, which is generally just very powerful thing to do as a witch, I think.
And does it also translate into the effectiveness of magic?
I think so, yes. So when I was very, very young and I first started practicing magic, I always felt like there was something missing. There was something missing in my magic. And that was because I was drawing out rituals that I found in books that were written by Wiccans and modern day witches and such. So I was finding all these books, like I said, in charity shops and little secondhand shops and such, like Spells for Teenage Witches. And I was trying to copy the rituals in those books word for word. And of course, those rituals, those spells were usually written by English speakers, often by Americans and such. And I always felt like there was something missing, something that was detaching me from the magic that I was doing. A lot of the spells still worked, but maybe I didn't feel that depth of connection that I wanted to feel from it. And the most powerful magic that I would practice that I found actually worked effectively all the time and made me not only feel a connection to place, but also to myself, and made me feel much more rooted in my identity as a witch, were spells that I did or rituals that I conducted that weren't from books, that were just me walking up a hill and, feeling the power of the wind on a cliff overlooking the sea and screaming at the top of my lungs in honor of the gods of the sea and such. And I wanted something that would give me that feeling, but still gave me a connection to a kind of more standardized idea of witchcraft. And it's only when I started incorporating, say, the names of local deities or words and kind of incantations that were traditionally found throughout Welsh history and such, that I started going, oh, I'm connecting to something deeper here. I'm connecting to something that is completely beyond myself. I'm connecting not only to my culture, to my language, and to my heritage, but also to the land itself, to the landscape, and everything that has happened here over thousands of years. So it's almost like by embracing the culture, it helped the effectiveness and the efficacy of my work to just skyrocket. So it's something that I push as much as I can when I teach or when I write or anything like that. It's how embracing those parts of culture can also help you deepen your roots as a witch, because it did for me, so why can't it for you?
Mm. And how is a Welsh witchcraft spell structured, or even ritual? Does it have a specific structure? We are used to thinking of Wicca as something that has the idea of circle casting and then calling upon the elements, and then you have, there's a set and structure to the rituals. Is there any specific structure to Welsh witchcraft rituals, or if there isn't a structure, are there recurring steps or recurring things that one has to do?
I think with that question, it depends on whether we're talking historically or in a kind of modern sense. Historically speaking, magic was only really employed when things were needed. When we're looking at things like the early modern period, where we have the best recorded evidence of folk magic that occurred in Wales now, most magic was done because it was a means to an end. It was usually something that needed to be done. It's said that the most effective magic within a Welsh cultural context was carried out by people who crossed the barriers of social class and such. So, for example, it was believed that the lower classes, and specifically women in particular, were said to be the best people when it comes to casting a curse or any kind of baneful form of magic, because they crossed that barrier, that boundary of social class. And we see in a lot of these cursing traditions that they talk about, there is this methodology that they use. A lot of the magic that we see throughout Welsh folk magical traditions tend to be very theatrical in nature, very over the top. So, for example, a very standard curse that a woman would cast on a man that had displeased her was she would walk up to him wailing, and she would fall to her knees, lift her arms to the sky, and she would start screaming and shouting profanities. So she would start swearing, she would start screaming insults at him, and this would scare the men, and they would just keep doing this, and then they might incant something like, Melltith Duw ar y neb a sydd wedi, whatever they might say, which translates to something like, oh, the curse of God upon those who dare to displease me. And the only way that you could break that curse was by begging their forgiveness and getting them to bless you, or by carrying out other folk magical kind of methods of your own. And we see in that kind of method, the very theatrical method, and these theatrical methods of cursing could really go very over the top sometimes. There's one instance in particular that I love, where a woman fell to her knees and pulled out her breasts, and she wafted her breasts in this guy's face, and she shouted, "These yellow breasts have given suck to those who will rinse their hands of your blood." So essentially, it was a death curse. She was wishing death upon him. And the way that she did that was by screaming profanities and wiggling her tits in his face. And there's just something quite powerful in that imagery, even though there's also something that makes us giggle today. There's something, there's a kind of power behind the the visual of a man looking at a woman doing that in front of him and being terrified, being absolutely terrified that she wielded such power over him. There's also instances of charming where people use charms. And when we think of charms today, we tend to think of, like an object that you carry on you, like a lucky charm. But in a Welsh context, a charm or a swin, we call them in Welsh, swinion, they were spoken words. They were words that held power, and they were usually either spoken or they were written down on paper. And these words followed a particular pattern and such. So we have little dribs and drabs of things like that we can pull inspiration from and see that magic was theatrical, and it was also very word heavy, very, very word heavy. So whether it was the spoken word or the written word, there was a lot of words in it. So we don't have any instance of kind of a very particular method of ritual magic other than what we find in the grimoire traditions, which some cunning folk and such used to employ. We don't have that many rituals like that. There are a few rituals to conjure things like the Tylwyth Teg, which require certain things. But the core kind of themes that I've come across by looking at it from both a mythic, folkloric, and historic sense, by looking at all mythology, folklore, and history, is that the first kind of thing that you need really, really deeply in order to practice magic in a Welsh context is a connection to the landscape, a connection to the natural world around you. So you need to have a deep connection with whatever nature is found within your locale. The second thing that you need is a connection to language and words. So all the most powerful magicians, witches, sorcerers from Welsh mythology, folklore, and even history are said to be very good weavers of words. They're poets, they're inspired folk, they are people who can weave poetry in a very effective way to the point where their poetry becomes magic. And one of the most powerful figures we have in our myths is a guy called Taliesin. And Taliesin means the radiant brow. And he was born from a witch, and he was very powerful. And he has these poems where he talks about himself as if he's been reincarnated over and over and over again. And he is also the greatest poet in all the land. And that's a common theme that we find. So most of the most powerful magicians, prophets, and witches were also deeply connected with the bardic tradition and with poetry. So you need a connection to nature or the natural landscape around you, and a connection to words. And then the third thing that we see prop up a lot is some form of magical tool being used, being utilized. And the magical tools that tend to be the most important within a Welsh context. So we don't have like a whole array of tools that would be used. We don't have an altar that's covered in, all these different tools. There is usually one tool that is the core of the ritual, and that would be either the wand, so the hidlath. We can go back and look at stories that extend all the way back to like the 9th century that talk about the importance of the hidlath, the wand, within a Welsh cultural context. And the wand, I wouldn't envision something like we would think nowadays. When we tend to think of wands nowadays, we tend to think of like the wand that Tinkerbell uses at the beginning of Disney movies, or the wand that's used in films like Harry Potter, where it's this small kind of stick that people waft around. Whereas hidlath, the word for wand in Welsh, translates to mean a yard of magic. So it's a yard of magic. And they're usually made of wood, and they're usually around the size of, say, a walking stick nowadays. So they're more like a staff, if we were to think of it like that. And the wand is employed by characters like Gwydion, who is this powerful magician and some would argue god in Welsh mythology. It's also used by his uncle Math, who is a magician king from Welsh mythology. But then we also see wands being used in folk magic as well. So, for example, in certain ceremonial forms of magic to conjure and summon the fairies, the fair folk of Welsh lore, they use wands made of hazel trees. So wands are an important tool, and sometimes you see wands, but wands tend to be heavily masculine, usually associated with male figures, with male magicians. Whereas the other tool that we see come up a lot is the cauldron. And though it's tempting to say that the wand is masculine and the cauldron is feminine, that's not quite true. The cauldron seems to just be neutral. So while the wand tends to be like almost symbolic of other parts and such, the cauldron tends to be a bit more neutral in that we see characters like Ceridwen, who is a goddess of witchcraft but also of inspiration, using her cauldron. We also see male characters who have cauldrons as well, and they tend to be associated with giants and such as well. So it's usually the cauldron or the wand that is the centerpiece of the magical ritual within a Welsh context. So it's those three ingredients that are the primary things that make a ritual within a Welsh sense. It's the connection to landscape and nature, a connection with words and a mastery over words and poetry and such, and a magical tool, usually a cauldron or a wand, to help focus the magic on something. And with those three together, you will create powerful magic. So in my book, when I wrote the ritual section of the book was kind of aimed at beginners and people who are interested in Welsh stuff. So the ritual practice that I lay out in my book isn't a traditional kind of Welsh ritual. It's a ritual that is inspired by Welsh folklore and mythology, but is rooted in what a lot of witches today would find familiar. So there are things like calls to the elements and calls to certain gods and such, which we don't see that often in more historical or folkloric practice, but it's something that would be very familiar for any witches, so it would make the ritual more accessible for them. So my personal rituals nowadays tend to involve a lot of spoken word, a lot of incantation, which is poetic based. There are calls to the Awen, calls to that divine inspiring force, and it focuses on a connection to the natural world as well as my connection to culture and landscape. So that's how I kind of forge my rituals, if that makes any sense.
Yes, absolutely. And can anyone practice Welsh witchcraft, or do you have to be Welsh, natively Welsh?
So one big misconception about what it means to be Welsh, or specifically, this is where I get on my high horse and might offend people, but there's this whole idea that being Celtic, being any form of Celtic, because Welsh culture comes under the umbrella of Celtic. So there's no such thing as one Celtic culture. There's no such thing as this one homogenized Celtic culture. Celtic is a rough umbrella term that academics usually use in order to encapsulate various cultures that are connected usually by things like language and art. So it's mostly language, but there is also these artistic things that connect the Celts as well. And Celtic is a very broad word, and there's a lot of debates as to whether we should use it at all. But one thing that's very, very clear that everyone agrees with, whether you are an academic who does not like the term Celtic and would prefer we didn't use it anymore, or whether you are the most, LARP-loving Celtic fanatic who pretends to be a Celtic shaman whenever you want. One thing we all agree on, mostly, so long as you're well informed, is that the term Celtic has nothing to do with DNA or with blood. Celtic is a term that denotes culture, and culture isn't something that is carried in blood or in race or in anything like that. Culture is something that is rooted in how we live our lives. Our culture is the language that we speak, it is the songs that we sing, the food that we eat, the places that we visit, the things that we do, the way that we interact with the world. That is culture. And culture is not something that is restricted to a certain blood type or a certain race or anything like that. So, for example, there's a lot of people who come to me and they say, "Oh, I'm Welsh because I found out that I've got 3% Welsh DNA." And I always go, "Well, but what connection do you have to Welsh culture? What are you doing?" And I think some people get really annoyed when I say that, when they get very like, "Oh, how dare you try and say I'm not Welsh?" And I'm like, well, if you're not interacting with Welsh culture, then you're not Welsh. But that doesn't mean you can't be. That doesn't mean you can't be eventually. All you need to do in order to be Welsh is interact with Welsh culture and immerse yourself in what it means to be Welsh. And that's the same for most of the Celtic cultures. So, for example, I've got this wonderful friend, this one friend who is really, really close to me, and she was born in Jordan. She was born in Jordan, but she moved to Wales when she was 6 years old. And to me, she is Welsh through and through, because she speaks the Welsh language, she has performed at Eisteddfods, she takes part in Welsh culture, and she sees herself as Welsh fully. But if she were to take a DNA test, her DNA test would not say Welsh. But she is Welsh to me. So to me, it's all about culture, not about blood or DNA. And, if you want to be part of Welsh culture, then you need to back it up by doing something cultural to go with that. So learning about our history, learning about our heritage, learning about our language. Not necessarily, you don't have to become a fluent Welsh speaker, because trust me, there's plenty of Welsh people who do not speak Welsh. But you do need to be in some sort of interaction with Welsh culture. And when we think of it in that way, then everything, so if we were to talk about it in internet buzz terms now, I don't think that it is cultural appropriation for somebody to try and practice a ritual that is found in Welsh magic if they're not Welsh. But I do find it cultural appropriation for them to take something that is Welsh, rip it from its root, and turn it into something that it's not, and still try and claim that it's Welsh. That is when it starts getting iffy to me. So one particular example of that is, and again, I'm going to ruffle feathers by saying this, the word Mabon. So a lot of people might know it as Mabon, the autumn equinox within the kind of neo-pagan wheel of the year. The word Mabon is actually pronounced Mabon, and it's a Welsh word, and it has nothing to do with the autumn equinox. It was a word that was ripped out of Welsh culture and plastered onto the wheel of the year in the 1970s, not even like as far back as Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner had nothing to do with it. He never called the autumn equinox Mabon or Mabon. It was plastered by an author who decided that he liked the name. I like this name. I love Mabon. And I think the autumn equinox is too much of a mouthful and isn't poetic and pretty enough. So I'll use the word Mabon instead. And now nobody knows that. And I find that quite disrespectful. And I've talked about it a lot over on my account and such, how I don't particularly find it disrespectful that people are using the word Mabon, but I do find it disrespectful that they're arguing with Welsh people who tell them, hey, that's not how it's pronounced. It's pronounced Mabon, not Mabon. There are people who will argue against that and be like, well, it's my accent, it's my dialect. No, you have the capability, no matter what your accent or dialect is, to say Mabon instead of Mabon. So it's kind of like, ugh, that's not an accent, that's just a mispronunciation. But also, what I also find quite rude is the way that people will go, oh, but things change, words change, they change their meaning, because this is a word that has been ripped from its cultural context and nobody acknowledges where it originally comes from. And that's when alarm bells start buzzing for me. So if somebody took my book, for example, Welsh Witchcraft, and they practiced one of the spells or one of the rituals that were in there, and they had a reverence and a respect for the fact that it is Welsh, it is rooted in Welsh culture, and they acknowledge where it comes from and how it is carried out, even if they take that and change it slightly, I'm fine with that. But if they were to take it and completely rip it apart, twist it into something else, but they still used, say, the Welsh words that I use and such, but they didn't acknowledge that it was Welsh, they didn't do anything like that, that's when I start getting a bit iffy. So for me, I welcome all. When Welsh people started traveling, so especially around the turn of, say, the 19th century, a lot of Welsh people started leaving Wales because they needed to find new opportunities and they were in poverty and such. So they ended up in places like Canada, America. A lot of them ended up at the Appalachians, and a lot of them ended up in Australia. And when they went, they took their culture with them and they shared it. They shared it with whoever would listen. They shared their stories. And we're the same today in Wales. If you walk into a pub in Wales and you ask someone, tell me a story from this region, tell me a story, or teach me a song from this region, we will happily teach you. We're always happy to share the culture with people. So it's all about respect, I suppose. It's all about respect. It's about respecting the culture, acknowledging where it comes from, listening to native voices when you can, and not kind of tearing it apart and turning it into something new. That's my kind of wall.
Yes, I'm familiar with the struggle because I'm a researcher of Italian witchcraft, and in the English-speaking world, there's a lot of nonsense about what is Italian witchcraft. But yeah, it's and recently I interviewed an Italian witch because there were a few Americans with Italian heritage who were asking me, can I practice Italian witchcraft since I have Italian heritage, or even I don't have Italian heritage. So I asked a few of my informants, and the answer was always the same. It's like, yeah, they can practice Italian witchcraft. They have to move here, speak the language, and be part of the Italian culture. So I think that I find it to be a very American thing, this fixation on DNA. I'm not sure if I don't think that I've ever heard those kind of conversations in Europe, in European countries. But I hear a lot from Americans, this idea, oh, I'm 10% Italian or Welsh or what? It's like culture is not the DNA. I address this also in my video on cultural appropriation. Or what is, because in order to talk about cultural appropriation, you have to first clarify what is culture. And I think that there is this trend, especially in America, in North America, that your culture is your DNA. That's not something that I had heard of, that I have heard about before, being in contact with Americans. But yeah, what you said also resonates with what I've heard from Italian witches. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and it's always a strange thing to try and tread, because when I do get questions like that about how it is that people from, say, the United States or Australia or Canada or anything like that would approach these kinds of things if they find that they have Welsh heritage or Welsh DNA or whatever it is, it's always a fine line, because I do empathize. I get it. Like, they've moved there, they've been ripped from their ancestral cultural background and placed on stolen land, essentially, into this monoculture that is very much devoid of any kind of spiritual grounding or connection to landscape. So I empathize, but I also wish there was a new way of looking at it, where there was a respect for the actual lived cultures rather than this obsession with blood and DNA, which can lead to very problematic kind of talking points and such. So it's always a very hard thing to navigate.
Exactly. The fixation with DNA can lead to very problematic ideologies. But I also agree that I empathize. In my case, for with the Italian Americans or Italian Canadians that want to reconnect with their heritage and their ancestry. That's very understandable, and I totally respect that. It is. I would just not put a focus on the DNA aspects, but so for instance, if you have a grandparent that was Italian or Welsh, you participated in the culture via your grandparent, and that is already different from claiming a cultural identity based solely on DNA, if that makes sense. So there has to be a cultural participation.
Absolutely.
And another question that I have about Welsh witchcraft and your practice, and then we will take some questions. So if you guys want to ask more questions in the chat, please do so. I've already saved a few of the questions that you have asked already. So my last question for now, I guess, is about deities and spirits. So what is the view of deities and spirits that you find in Welsh witchcraft? Is there a polytheistic view? Is there an animistic view of deities and spirits? How are they interacted with? How are they seen? Are they seen as objective entities outside of us, or like archetypes? So what is more generally the view of the spirit world, the spirits and the gods, the deities?
When you approach kind of deities specifically within a Welsh context, there's kind of two streams, and this is where it gets a bit complicated. So we have evidence of some of the pre-Christian practices that were carried out in what is now modern-day Wales. At one point in history, Wales didn't exist, obviously. Wales is quite a modern nation, and by modern I mean it's around 2,000 years old. So not as modern as, say, the United States, but it's still, modern in comparison to some. And the border of what is Wales and what is England and such didn't exist. And the entirety of what we now refer to as the island of Britain, the primary island of Britain, which covers England, Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall, at one point was all Brythonic. It was all a Brythonic culture, which is often shocking to people because they think of Scotland as a Gaelic culture, because Scotland nowadays speaks a Gaelic language. But the only reason that the Scottish people speak a Gaelic language is because the Irish Gaelic folks moved over to Scotland and essentially took land and made it their own. Before that happened, even the Scottish people spoke a Brythonic Celtic language related to the modern day Welsh language. So we see a lot of that preserved in Scottish place names and certain things like that. So we see this connection between what we now call the island of Britain at one point in the historical record, where most of the people spoke a Brythonic Celtic language, and they were what a lot of archaeologists might refer to as the Celts. And their culture, from what we can gather from very limited resources, because again, they didn't write anything down, they were a culture that was oral in nature, they didn't share things via written record and such. So we don't have as much record as, say, the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans or anything like that, the pagan kind of version of the Romans and such. We don't have as much evidence as to what the Celts did as we do for them, but we do have hints here and there. And from what we can gather, their culture was one that was heavily animistic. So they believed that the world around them was animate, was alive. Everything had a spirit. Everything was alive. Before the Romans came to Britain, there isn't much evidence of gods being personified as humans. There isn't much evidence to show that, they had figures of their gods and such. It was mostly they very much venerated the landscape itself. So a god was a river. A goddess was, the figure, the flowing power of the river through the landscape. And they didn't need to turn it into a human-shaped figure in order to understand that. They just understood the river is alive. It is what keeps the landscape alive and thriving and nourished. She is our goddess. And that's how it was carried out. And then after the Romans came, there's this strange idea that when the Romans came here, they just kind of slaughtered all the native Celtic peoples and pushed their culture onto them. But that's not quite what happened. It was more of a symbiotic relationship going on. There was some of that, but there was also a lot of kind of trade going on between Celtic tribes and the Romans and such. And once they arrived, a lot of the culture of the Romans started kind of making its way into the culture of the Celts, and we start seeing figures of gods and such being carved out into stone and such. So we have some reference to some kind of Brythonic gods and such. But for the most part, if you were to look up gods and goddesses of Wales today, if you were to look up, who are the gods of Wales, who are the spirits that we turn to in Wales, the list that you'll come across are characters like Ceridwen or Gwynap Nudd or Mabon. Mabon is one of them. Modron or Rhiannon. You'll come across names like these, and it'll be like Rhiannon is the goddess of sovereignty and also a goddess of horses, and Ceridwen is a goddess of witchcraft and inspiration, or Gwynap Nudd is a god of the other world, and he's also a god of fairies and a king of fairies even. So you'll come across information like that, but all of that information, all of those characters are coming to us via Christian culture. So we only know about them because of medieval manuscripts, that were recorded and gathered by monks during sometime between the 6th and the 14th centuries. The manuscripts that we have today are usually dated to around the 12th to 14th centuries, but we kind of accept and acknowledge that the stories that are recorded in those manuscripts are older than the manuscripts themselves. These manuscripts are like copies of a copy of a copy, and it's likely that these stories came from an older oral tradition of storytelling before that. So a lot of people will sometimes get up in arms and get very frustrated when you refer to these characters as gods, because nowhere in the literature, nowhere in the Christian medieval literature does it refer to them as gods. And of course it wouldn't, because the Christians don't want to acknowledge other gods, do they? So it wouldn't refer to them as gods. But we do have evidence of, say, in Ireland, where some of the older Irish gods were recorded in Christian manuscripts as gods. So there's this argument that characters like Rhiannon, Gwynap Nudd, Blodeuwedd, Lleu Gyffes, that they're not gods. They're just literary characters from Christian manuscripts. That's all they are. But then you can't deny the fact that there are hints throughout these stories to something older. So one thing in particular that is referenced a lot in these stories that are recorded in the manuscripts is Annwfn, the otherworld. And the otherworld in Welsh lore is not heaven, it's not hell, it doesn't fit into Christian cosmology. So it's likely that this idea, this concept of the otherworld, referred to as Annwfn, is something that comes to us from before Christianity. There's also a lot of reference to things like shape-shifting and magic and things that seem congruent with like cultures that would have been pre-Christian in nature. And then we also have the fact that a lot of the names of the characters tend to cognate with older Celtic and pre-Christian gods and entities. So the best example that I can actually give of that is Mabon. I spoke about Mabon a second ago, how the name Mabon was kind of yoinked from Welsh culture and plastered onto the Wheel of the Year as being the autumn equinox, even though in the Welsh stories, Mabon has nothing to do with the autumn equinox. There is nothing in the story that hints towards the story taking place at the autumn equinox. There is no like reference to what time of year it is at all in the story. But it is a story of a child, a baby, a divine child. So the name Mabon, Mab in Welsh means son, and the prefix of the suffix of on means like divine or great. So Mabon's name literally means the great or the divine son. And his mother is Modron. And the name Modron can be split up to Modr and On, which is essentially the divine or the great mother. So he is the great or divine son of the great or divine mother. And he was stolen from his mother at a very, very young, tender age and taken to a prison far, far away. And there's a whole story about how he's rescued and taken out of that prison and such. And a lot of people drew parallels, especially in like the 20th century and the 21st century. A lot of people started drawing parallels between that story and the story of Kor or Persephone in Greek culture. So they started saying, oh, Mabon is the Welsh version of the story of Persephone being raped by Hades. So we see that start to take place in discourses and discussions and such, and it doesn't quite fit because there aren't really, apart from the fact that he is a child of a deity who was stolen away, there are no other similarities. Like there is no reference to the landscape being depleted or deprived while he's gone. There is no reference to him coming back and it being a kind of, explanation for the seasons or anything like that. But people like to draw parallels. So that's how Mabon became the name of the autumn equinox. People were like, oh, this fits. We'll just put it there, even though it doesn't really fit. But Mabon, his name can be found preserved much older. So there is references on the continent of a Celtic deity called Maponos. And Maponos was a god of hunting and healing, and he's associated with dogs and sacred springs and such. And he was a god. We know this because there are inscriptions, pre-Christian inscriptions to the god Maponos. And we find inscriptions and references to this god Maponos not only on continental Europe in like what is now northern France, but also on what is now the island of Britain as well. There are references to Maponos throughout various parts of Britain, specifically in the north. There's a lot around the south of Scotland and such to Maponos. And there's no denying that it's likely that the name Mabon came from the name Maponos, especially because there is also the name Matrona, and Matrona probably became Modron, Mabon became Maponos became Mabon, and so we see these cognates, these parallels between Mabon and Maponos, Modron and Matrona. We see like lots of these links between these medieval Christian kind of manuscripts and the characters preserved within them, and older deities and themes that could probably be linked back to a pre-Christian past. So though the manuscripts themselves date to a period that is Christian, and there's a lot of people who like to look at them purely as medieval literature and nothing else, I like to argue that there is evidence that these probably carry echoes of pre-Christian beliefs. And so in modern day Wales, modern day pagans will refer to their gods by the names that they're found in the Mabinogi. So names like Rhiannon, Ceridwen, Mabon, Modron. These are the names that we will use during our rituals to refer to our gods. But there is also the argument that even beyond that, even if they have no reference, even if there's like an argument that can be made that they're not gods, they were never gods in the first place, I would argue they have become gods now. through the process of apotheosis. And the process of apotheosis is the idea that something can be made divine over time. So these characters like Rhiannon and Pwyll and Pryderi and Gwyn ap Nudd, who are found throughout our myths and stories and legends and tales that are like really, really popular across Wales, they've become almost emblems of what it means to be Welsh. They have carried Welsh tradition for so long. Poems have been written about them, songs have been sung about them, and they're still a huge part of the living culture of Wales today. And though you could argue that you could wander around the entirety of Wales and you will never find an ancient shrine to the goddess Ceridwen. Archaeologists have never found an ancient shrine to the goddess Ceridwen. But you can find a shrine to the goddess Ceridwen now, behind me, in my flat. You can find a shrine to the goddess Ceridwen at the goddess temple in Bala, next to Llyn Tegid, where her story takes place. There's an entire temple dedicated to her there now. So the idea that these can't be gods because they're not ancient gods is, number one, probably wrong, because they probably do have some kind of reference or echo of an older deity behind them. But even if they don't, they are gods now. They are gods now. So it is a polytheistic faith nowadays. It's also animistic. I very much echo the idea that animism is a huge part of our lived reality. And it's also a faith which is rooted in a love and a connection to the landscape itself, because their stories and their identities are rooted in their locales, and it's a huge part of our culture. So yeah, I hope that makes some kind of sense.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for answering. So I'll start asking questions from the audience. Frater RC is asking, does your book have much on the Bardic in it, or anything about Einigen? I'm not sure how to pronounce it correctly. Einigen the giant, perhaps?
So in terms of the bardic stuff, yes, there are references to the bardic tradition and to the kind of the evolution of the Welsh language and the influence that the bardic culture has on Wales today, but also on magic. There's a lot of that in the book. I do talk about it a lot more in my book that's coming out next year. This year, later this year, I've got a new book coming out, which I think a lot of people might overlook because it's a book on fairies. It's called Welsh Fairies, and it's coming out in November of this year, or October, one of them, I can't remember. And that one will explore themes of the otherworld and gods and such, as well as fairies, because the link between fairy folklore and the bardic tradition and gods is deep, 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 deep in Welsh tradition. So I do talk a lot about it in Welsh Witchcraft, but if you do want to learn more about it, I do also talk more about it in my next book, and I've also created videos and such on my YouTube about it as well, and there's going to be more coming. So even if you don't want to buy my books or support me in a monetary way, I do have free content about it as well on my podcast and on my YouTube channel. But no, I don't refer to, sorry, I forgot about the last part. I don't talk about the giant. I do talk about other giants, but not that one in particular, and haven't quite yet. But that's just yet, maybe one day.
And Spidey is asking, how would a disabled housebound witch stay connected to nature? I can't get out much.
So the biggest, so I have a lot of disabled friends and friends who have chronic illnesses and such, and they're also witches, and they navigate, how to be a witch and navigate their disabilities or their chronic illness. And there is a lot of guilt, I think, that comes around it. Now, I can't speak on their behalf because I don't have a disability nor a chronic illness, but having been friends with them for so long, I kind of noticed that there's a lot of guilt around it, because a lot of books and such will talk about this practice of witchcraft as if you constantly need to be going on 3-hour-long hikes and wandering down to the river and jumping into sacred wells and doing all these things that sometimes just aren't possible with you and your abilities and whatever's going on with you in your life at the minute. Like, there's a lot of factors that can come into play where you can't do that, even when it comes to things like mental health and such. I've known lots of people who struggle with depression, who go through periods where they can't leave the house, and they struggle with how how do they connect to nature in that way? The biggest advice I always give, and it's probably not the best advice, but it's all I can really give, is to acknowledge and remember that nature isn't something that is outside ourselves. We are nature. We are literally nature ourselves. So by connecting to yourself, your own body, your own rhythmic flow, by being kind to yourself, and by acknowledging what it is that you are able and not able to do, you are already in tune with nature in that regard. But you can also acknowledge that nature exists around us in the world all the time. Like, you can sit and you can connect with the birds that fly around your apartment building, or if you have a garden. I don't have a garden, so I can't even do this myself. If you have a garden, then even just sitting on the grass in the garden for like 10 minutes a day can be a huge thing. I know myself personally, I have moved recently, so I don't live in a rural kind of village anymore. When I used to live in a rural village, I used to go on walks all the time. I used to go on the beach all the time and such. And I've moved now to a rather busy city where any connection to kind of forests or beaches is a long way away, so I don't get to connect as much. But I found that even just going to the park and sitting for a bit has like really helped me to appreciate the fact that it doesn't seem to matter what we as humans do to the landscape. Nature still prevails. Like, I love going to those places in the city where nature has taken back, where roots are growing out of the ground, where things like that are happening. But honestly, just watching the cycles of nature and getting in touch with what's on your front door, like out your window, that's also connecting to nature. And don't let anyone tell you that it's not. But also, your own body is also a temple of nature itself, is what I will always say, especially within a Welsh context. We spoke about it earlier, the power of breath, the power of words. Like, start attuning yourself to your own breath and your own awen, and that in itself is deeply visceral and transformative. I don't know if that's any help, but I hope it can offer some guidance.
I think it was beautifully said. Thank you. And Lord Inquisitor is asking, any unique elements to Welsh witchcraft that distinguishes it apart from European or other British traditions? I think you touched a bit on that already, but maybe to summarize.
Yes, absolutely. So there's one part about Welsh kind of witchcraft history that I didn't touch upon, and that is the way in which the Welsh responded to what we now refer to as the kind of witch craze that took upon Europe. I know a lot of academics don't like that term anymore, but the period in time, in the early modern period, when witch hunts took place, when people were being persecuted under accusations of witchcraft, Wales had a really strange relationship with witchcraft during that period. Very strange, in that we share a border with England. We don't have water that disconnects us. And, borders over here are not like borders elsewhere. There's no kind of wall that separates us from England. We can just walk between England and Wales. And despite the fact that we have no clear border, no water that separates us or anything, we had an entirely different culture this side of the border to what the English had on their side. So to give you some numbers, some figures, historically speaking, there was upwards of almost 2,000 people that were taken to court under accusations of witchcraft in England that we know of. Upwards of 2,000 people. And of that 2,000 people, there were upwards of around 500 people that were executed or persecuted and found guilty of witchcraft. When we compare that with Wales, the figures are really vastly different. So keep those numbers in mind. 2,000 people taken to court under accusations, 500 people executed or persecuted. In Wales, the amount of people that were taken to court on accusations of witchcraft were around 40. And of that 40, only around 3 or 4 people were found guilty. So, and of those 3 or 4 people that were found guilty, most of them were not executed. So we didn't have this craze, this hysteria that seemed to take place across most of Western Europe, which saw people constantly persecuting others on accusations of witchcraft. And there's a lot of theories as to why this is, why we didn't have as many witch trials. One theory talks about how the Welsh were more obsessed with thieves at the time, because if we compare the records, there were more thieves that were persecuted during that period. So it's almost like the Welsh were more concerned about their cheese and their sheep being stolen than they were worried about witches. Another theory, which I quite like, but I know a lot of people who study the early modern witch trials don't like, is that the Welsh were more likely to blame fairies for any wrongdoing. Like, if you were going to blame a supernatural entity on any mischief, malice, or ill kind of wishes or anything like that happened to you, any bad luck, misfortune, and such, you were more likely to blame fairies than you were witches. So rather than being like, oh, it's Julie down the road, she cursed me, you were more likely to go, oh no, it's those silly, stupid fairies. They've done it again, and I need to call the local cunning woman and have her put some anti-fairy kind of charms around my farm so that they don't do it again. But another theory, which I quite like as well, is that the belief and the culture of magic was just different here. And I think that theory is kind of uplifted by the fact that we didn't even have a native word for the witches that we put on trial. So when in the Welsh language courts, when people were put on trial on accusations of witchcraft, the word that they used to accuse them with was wits or witch, which is just a Welshification of the English word witch. We didn't even have a native word for this idea of a witch in order to persecute people under. It's also really interesting to point out that where the majority of witch trials did happen in Wales were in very urbanized areas and very anglicized areas, so areas that had a heavy population of English. So we see a lot of witch trials happening along the borderlands and in big urban areas. We don't see it as much happening in rurality. So it's almost like the English influence brought the witch trials here, and the Welsh were like, we don't know what that is. We don't know what a witch trial or a witch even is, despite the fact that we have numerous words in our language to describe what we would probably call witches today. We have so many. We have Swynydd, we have Gwrach, we have Gwyddon, we have Dyn Hysbys. We have so many terms to describe people who practice magic. And yet, when we took people to court under accusations of witchcraft, we didn't use any of those words. We borrowed the English word because it was such a foreign concept to us. So there is this theory that perhaps the Welsh just had a very different relationship with magic. We couldn't understand the idea of magic being purely of the devil. It just didn't make sense to us. And even in those witch trials that did happen, we never see mention of the devil. The devil never comes up. There is no kind of insinuation that the belief was that witches were under the work of the devil, as we see in England or as we see in other parts of Europe. There just wasn't that association. Witches were usually seen as people who were sometimes in cahoots with fairies or sometimes in cahoots with local spirits. But for the most part, they were just people who could practice magic, and they were good if you needed help, but they could also burn you, so you needed to be careful around them. And I just love that fact. I love the idea that, you know, we just didn't buy into it as much as the folks over the border did. We just didn't have as many witch trials. So I think that tells us a little something about the culture of witchcraft and magic here in Wales.
Thank you. And the Torch is asking, I am a Black American. I recently found out my surname is of Welsh origin and always fascinated with Celtic and Welsh magic. Would me being a Black American prevent me from practicing Welsh magic?
I'm going to say something controversial. The only thing that might hinder you even more than being Black is being American. Sorry. But there are Black Welsh people. There are people here in Wales who are Black, who are very much Welsh, more Welsh than I am in some cases. And I don't think that would hinder you in any way. The biggest hindrance, as we were talking about when we were talking about the difference between DNA and culture, is whether you interact with the culture. So the fact you have that connection, you know that your surname is of Welsh origin, that's already something to start on. You know, start looking into, where does that surname come from? Where is it like most common in Wales? Could you maybe possibly do a family tree? I know that's not possible for everyone, but if you could you trace back where your ancestors were. But even if not, you could look to where that surname is most common in Wales and maybe look at the culture of that specific region and then start interacting with the culture, you know, learn a little bit about the Welsh language, learn a little bit about our history. An important thing I would say to all people watching who have an interest in Welsh things, whether you have a Welsh ancestry or not, but in particular, especially if you have Welsh ancestry and you want to embrace that Welsh culture, is start looking at things like what's the difference between terms like British and Welsh? What does the word Welsh even mean and where does it come from etymologically? Because there's a huge movement right now in Wales to stop using the word Wales and the word Welsh. There's a huge movement of people trying to rally to stop us using the words Wales and Welsh and instead use words like Cymru and Cymraeg, which are the native words for who we are. Because the word Welsh in and of itself comes from a rather negative stereotype about us. So it's important to look into these things and connect more with the culture than it is to focus on the DNA or the blood or anything like that. So yes, Wales is a modern nation. We have people of all races, of all cultural backgrounds who live here today who are still very much Welsh. And it's not a hindrance, I don't think, in any way. It's just, you know, if you're American, you're across the sea, so you have that barrier. But the biggest barrier will be that you didn't, have that privilege of being able to grow up in the culture. So now you have to connect to it in a different way. But the fact you're watching this means you're already doing that a little bit. You're already looking for a little bit of an in into Welsh culture. But I would also say to anyone who is in the United States and in Australia, there's a lot in Australia as well. There are a lot of diaspora. I never know how to say that word. Diaspora. There are a lot of diaspora groups that are in various places nowadays who are uplifting Welsh culture and kind of talking about the culture of what it means to be Welsh American or Welsh Australian or Welsh Canadian. So find groups like that as well if it's safe and comfortable for you to do so, and then kind of approach it from that way. The biggest thing is to try and connect with the culture. But the fact that you are watching this and might read my book or might consume more of my content and such means you're already doing that. So keep at it, essentially.
I'm not sure what this means, but maybe it means something to you. Does Mara still feel you don't belong here, so you can just move along from episode 3 of Welsh Witch podcast when it comes to people embracing their Welsh ancestral culture?
Ooh, I'm not sure what that means either. It's been a long while since I did my episode 3. You don't belong here, so you can just move along. Oh, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
I think you expressed how you feel about people doing, practicing Welsh witchcraft, and it is participating in the culture. So I'm not sure exactly what that sentence means out of context. It doesn't mean anything. So, yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know. The only thing I would say is that I know that I've also had my struggles with identity when it comes to being Welsh. So it's not something that is unique to people that aren't born here either. Just know that there are those of us who were born here, who speak the language as our first language, who still sometimes get that feeling of, do I actually belong? I grew up in a very rural area as not just a Welsh woman, but a queer woman who didn't quite fit in. I'm also neurodivergent. So all of that, being autistic, being queer, in a rural Welsh place made me often feel like I didn't belong and I wasn't allowed to embrace my Welsh heritage and culture because I didn't fit in with what it meant to be Welsh in a more modern sense. A lot of modern Welsh culture is built around what your accent sounds like. I don't have a particularly strong Welsh accent. A lot of it is built around rugby and football and farming and all these things. And there was a lot of feelings when I was growing up that I didn't fully belong, and I couldn't wait to leave. I couldn't wait to leave Wales. That was my biggest thing when I was younger, when I was a teenager and I was being bullied tremendously. I just couldn't wait to leave. And now I look back and I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I had those feelings, because now I embrace what it means to be Welsh, and I say sod that to anyone who tries to tell me I'm not Welsh enough. So yeah, if you ever feel like you're not good enough to be Welsh, if you are participating in the culture, if you are learning Welsh and you don't feel like you're learning quick enough, or if you are somebody who grew up in Wales and you don't speak the Welsh language, don't let anyone tell you that you're any less Welsh because of that. You are just as Welsh as anyone else. So yeah, just if you feel like you don't fit fully, I do sympathize, because I've also felt that. And it's important that we acknowledge those feelings and learn that they don't mean anything at the end of the day. We belong and we are allowed to be here.
Last question, and then we can wrap up. Book references for Welsh folklore?
So the easiest book references that I have are the things that are available for free. You can find a lot of things for free on things like the Gutenberg Project, and in the public domain. There are a lot of things that are in the public domain nowadays, so you can find PDFs of them online. A lot of them are from the 19th century and such, so they are written a little weirdly, and sometimes they're a bit difficult to read, but they are treasure troves of knowledge. One of my favorites is Elias Owen's Welsh folklore. So Elias Owen, Welsh folklore. His book goes into various different folk tales, various different folk customs, beliefs, and practices. It'll teach you lots of stories that are completely Welsh, but it will also teach you like beliefs and practices. And there's an entire section on witchcraft, on charms, on magical practices that were carried out and such that he recorded. One that I would personally try and avoid, but it's very hard because they're free and they're available everywhere, are the books by Marie Trevelyan. So keep an eye out for the name Marie Trevelyan. I would say still read them if you so wish, but take anything that's in Marie Trevelyan with a pinch of salt, because Marie Trevelyan was known to embellish her sources and make a lot of things up. So a lot of it isn't quite as accurate as one would hope. So she's one that I would avoid, but I still like to read them from time to time and try and figure out where she got certain things from, and they are available for free. There's also Wirt Sykes's British Goblins, which by the title you wouldn't think it was anything to do with Wales, but it is. British Goblins is, until I've just written my book recently on Welsh fairies, there was not really a comprehensive guide to Welsh fairies other than Wirt Sykes's British Goblins. It is essentially just a huge book that talks only about Welsh fairy traditions, fairy customs, fairy beliefs. So yeah, Wirt Sykes, British Goblins, Elias Owen, Welsh folklore, T. Gwyn Jones, Welsh folklore, any of those are really, really good. You can also read my book if you want to purchase a book. I've just been working on my new Welsh fairies book, which is more on folklore. And I also obviously have the podcast, the YouTube, all of that, where I think I've done a few videos on book recommendations and such. So if you want to look into those, then it will give you a bit more of a deeper grounding. But I hope I've mentioned a few now that might be worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Mara. And I was about to ask you, where can people find you, but you kind of already mentioned it. So yeah, to anybody of you guys interested in Welsh witchcraft and Welsh folklore, subscribe and follow her on any of the platforms. And you find also everything in the description box. So anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
All I will say is I am like a rash, so now that you've rubbed up against me, I'll be everywhere, and you'll be applying your anti-Mara cream soon because I'll be popping up everywhere. If you want to find me, I'm pretty much everywhere. I'm on every social platform under Mara_Starling, just as it's written on screen. And yes, I have my Welsh witchcraft book, but I also have a new book releasing in autumn of this year, Welsh Fairies, so keep an eye out for that one. And if you'd like to learn more, then do come find me elsewhere.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Mara, for coming on. It was a great interview, and I'm sure that the audience loved it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun.
I'm glad. So thank you again. So to all of you guys, I hope that you liked this interview. And if you did, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. activate the notification bell so that you are always notified when I'm live or when I upload a new video, and share this video around so that more people can know about Welsh witchcraft. And as you know, this project can only exist thanks to your support. So if you have the means, I would really appreciate it if you support my work with a one-off PayPal donation by joining memberships, my here on YouTube, my Inner Symposium on Patreon and Ko-fi. And also you can check out my services at drangelapuka.com. So everything will be in the description box, all the links, and in a pinned comment. So thank you all for considering, and I hope that you all stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.